Before we begin, keep in mind that this is the second part of a two-part episode focusing on representation in video games. You can definitely listen to it as a standalone podcast episode, but if it is a topic of interest, I'd suggest taking a listen to part 1 as well. When I started planning season 2 for Tech Girl Talks, I knew exactly what I wanted each episode to focus on, and I actually had a wish list for the guests I wanted to add value. I was well aware that I was aiming for big names in the gaming and esports industry globally, and honestly, I didn't know if I'd actually get everyone on the list to come on the podcast. I did. Almost all of them agreed when I asked, and I couldn't believe my luck. However, the first guest I tried to get is the one that you'll actually get to hear today. I knew I wanted to talk about representation in video games, and I knew that I wanted a member of a development team from a AAA title to add insight. I also knew the game I wanted the dev to be working on. Devs make video games. They're busy working on the art we love. Also, the podcast was relatively unknown, and I was based in a region that probably sells the same amount of games in a year that most London-based gaming stores sell in a week. Which is why I'm a bit shell-shocked to let you know that season 2 of Tech Girl Talks will feature every single wishlist guest I had. Because for this episode, we have a member of a development team adding their own insights on representation in video games while working on a personal favorite of mine and one of the bigger first-person shooter multiplayer offerings currently available.
I'm Simon Ducharme. That's a French name. Don't worry about it. I am a narrative writer / script writer on Rainbow Six Siege. I've been with the team for a little over a year, so I've worked on like 2 characters so far, although I do kind of help with the ones that I'm not assigned to. And yeah, that's been my my role for a little bit.
In the first part of this episode, the fantastic Robin Gray added insight from the perspective of gamers who enjoy playing video games, as well as the perspective of gaming media, with him being the founder of Gaming magazine. This insight was invaluable because ultimately it spoke to the consumer of games as well as the general narrative around the topic. However, I wanted Simon to join the conversation because I don't think we hear nearly enough from the development team of the games we love. The gaming industry operates in this weird space where we tend to celebrate the people who play the games versus those that actually make them. Think about the fame and adoration thrown at streamers or competitive esports players. We don't see nearly the same level of fan adoration towards the people ultimately creating the games we're playing. In the age of social media, we also tend to speak on behalf of the devs, and I'll reference a lot of social commentary in this episode as an example. Before we do that though, let me give you a little bit of insight if you've never heard of the game Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege. Siege is a first-person shooter. The 5v5 multiplayer sees you either play as an attacking or defending operator. You then either try rescuing a hostage, defusing a bomb, or taking control of a specific objective on different maps. Each operator has a specific set of skills and various gadgets and the like to aid them. The operators are special forces operatives from different countries around the world. Each has a backstory that explains how they go about joining Rainbow and also gives a bit more insights into the specific skills and gadgets they utilize. While there's no campaign mode in the game, I've always loved how the narratives of the characters script their style of gameplay or the advantages and disadvantages they bring to a game when you select them. For me, the gameplay of many of the operators almost always mirrors their personality traits. So let me give you an example. Ash is an attacking operator. In terms of gameplay, you can choose to play with one of 2 assault rifles and one of 2 handguns. You can also choose to equip her with either breaching rounds, which allow you to break open soft walls and doors, or you can get a claymore for extra utility. Her main gadget is a gun that shoots breaching rounds out, so from that alone, you hopefully realize that as an attacker, her job is to ultimately breach site first and allow her teammates a clearer path. An entry fragger, if you will. Her narrative, though, feeds this really well. So, as a character, she was a member of the Israeli Defense Forces and FBI SWAT before being recruited to Rainbow because of her demolition expertise, but also her leadership qualities. She's regularly the team lead in the operations showcased on the shoulder content for Siege, which comprises of various short format films on YouTube. That confident and strong leader ties directly into the gameplay where Ash is ultimately your first breach. Making sense? As we see more diversity in video game character narratives and scripts, we've also seen a lot of social commentary arguing that developers need to keep that front of mind. With a game like Siege, where the operators are meant to be the best in the world with specific skills, and thus come from a host of different countries and cultures, surely it isn't a matter of developers keeping diversity front of mind so much as them following the story of the game, which ultimately means having a diverse representation of operators because, well, that's kind of the world, right?
I think with Siege, like it's a game that really like borrows itself well to something like that. But like I don't know if front of mind is the term I would use. It's more like it's something that's very important, but also is like at the same level of importance as everything else. Because oftentimes what we see is that representation is something that people think is like less important in some form, but for us is like it's one of the components that make the game what it is. Like to me, Siege is like you're not just playing as like a faceless, voiceless soldier. You're playing a person, and that's why representation is important because we are creating people. The game is just kind of in a way made for that. Like I don't know if that was the intention to start with, but it's certainly works very well because Rainbow narratively is an organization that's with like people from all across the globe. So obviously you're going to see characters from different cultures, and to do something other than that would be a disservice. So I think it's great that we get to do that. We get to look at a lot of different cultures, a lot of different backgrounds, and just represent that as authentically as we can.
I mentioned at the start of this episode that I really wanted someone from the Siege team to add insight, and there was actually a very specific reason, or at least a specific operator that led to this decision. In part one of this episode, I spoke about the character of Sindel in Mortal Kombat and her impact on me as a young gamer, but I also mentioned Malusi, an operator from Siege. Malusi is a South African woman of color who led an anti-poaching unit in Africa before joining Siege, or Rainbow if you like. Over the years, big global games have featured South African characters, and we have had a diverse range of South African characters, but the ones that I remember tend to be white male mercenaries with thick Afrikaans, which is a language spoken in South Africa similar to Dutch accents. For me, Malusi was a breath of fresh air, especially considering it would have been easy to incorporate the stereotypical style of a South African in an FPS game focused on terrorism.
I guess for Malusi, my insight is more like I was like on the project, but not as a writer, so I kind of saw her from the outside. But I did see like something that is in line with what we still do today on the narrative team is when we create a character, we really want like a strong narrative, someone that is really interesting and just inspirational. And that's, I think, Malusi is one of the best examples of that because those women who are anti-poachers in South Africa are some of the most inspiring people I can think of. I just think they're so kick-ass, and that's one of the coolest things you can do today in life.
Simon mentions an all-woman anti-poaching unit there, and it was something that stood out for me with Malusi because her backstory utilized a real-life movement making real change locally. The unit in question is the Black Mambas, an anti-poaching unit founded in 2013 that protects a specific section of a well-known nature reserve in southern Africa. The Black Mambas is made up almost entirely of women, so I thought I'll read an excerpt from their website to give you a bit more clarity. The team works to the concept of the broken window philosophy, striving to make our area of influence the most undesirable, most difficult, and least profitable place to poach any species. With a passion for wildlife and rhino conservation, these women are the voice in the community through their conservation work. The objectives of the Black Mamba Project are not only the protection of rhinos through boots on the ground, but also through being a role model in their communities. These 23 young rangers and 7 environmental monitors want their communities to understand that the benefits are greater through rhino conservation rather than poaching, addressing the social and moral decay that is a product of the rhino poaching within their communities. Rhino poaching is big business in southern Africa, and anti-poaching is an incredibly dangerous job because the cost of a rhino horn to many poachers outweighs the cost of human life. The Black Mamba's story is inspirational, and while the likes of National Geographic have covered it, I would by no means say that it's a global mainstream story. There's a specific reason for me bringing this story up because I think it speaks to the nature of representation in video games. Simply adding a mix of skin colors and genders or sexualities isn't what I define as representation. It's about telling real stories about different cultures and diverse people. And doing that isn't easy. It requires research and a great understanding of said cultures, as Simon explains.
It varies depending on the character, depending on the profile. We always do research. We always talk to people who are local to these communities to make sure that we're representing something that is authentic and that they want people to see. I know that we certainly did that with Malusi. We did that with a lot of our characters that I worked on, or like, kind of helped on.
When you're writing a movie character, or maybe you're writing a character for a book, or maybe you're just writing a character for a blog post, or whatever you're doing, writing, talking, any of that, you're creating the narrative only. That research exists there too, the research that we've just spoken about, but games are a little bit different because the character has this narrative and a background, but that also has to fit into the specific mechanics of the game. So remember my Ash example at the start of this? There needs to be a tie-in between the actual gameplay and the character on the screen. If there isn't, the game can lose the attention of the person playing it. This is why I so desperately wanted someone on a dev team to give insight, because I don't think any of us, who have never made a game at least, appreciate the balancing act that needs to take place or how this even works. There's so many questions you need to start asking. Does the narrative come first, followed by the gameplay then being created around that? Or is the narrative written around the gameplay mechanics? Thank goodness I could ask someone who knows.
It kind of informs each other, because I like the gameplay is kind of being developed in parallel. So we can't be too strict about it. We kind of mostly base it on like where we want to go, the kind of things we want to see, the kind of people we want to introduce, because ultimately, like, we want to introduce a varied roster of people that don't feel like the same character being introduced twice. Narrative side, at least, we have things we want to do, like, for example, we eventually wanted to do a First Nations character, and the time was right it was year 6, season 2. We said, okay, that's when we're going to do it, and so we're going to craft a character around that, and that's essentially what we did. And then like the gameplay side, it was more like, let's kind of steer her career-wise to something that works with what we're giving her.
Many years ago, entertainment wasn't diverse, and to be fair, it still struggles now. You likely know exactly what I mean. We've seen movie casts with only one woman as the token love interest, one person of color in a movie with a few lines. Interesting characters were almost inherently reserved for specific groups of people. The leading lady was almost always under 30 years old. The superhero, almost always a male of a specific skin color. That started to change and is at least changing as we move. However, whenever the topic of representation in video games comes up, there's inevitably a conversation online on the likes of, say, Twitter or Reddit, where the term box ticking is thrown about. Most commonly, when more diverse characters are introduced, or these characters actually lead a story. The term box ticking ultimately implies that video game writers and designers are told they must write or introduce a character that ticks a specific box relating to culture or race or gender, sexuality. I mean, I could go on. While I 100% believe diversity should be front of mind as we create and tell stories, as a creative myself, I find this idea of box ticking somewhat insulting, because it breaks down interesting characters to one or two aspects of what they are. None of us are defined by one or two things. Real people are multi-layered and formed through not only things like our race, gender, culture, or sexuality, but also by real lived experiences. TLDR, which means too long don't read if you're not a gamer, the idea that characters are written based off box ticking is absolutely ludicrous to me.
Boxes needing to be ticked is something that comes from a very pejorative mindset. I guess, the way I see it is that we have characters and profiles that we want to do, and we want to do authentically. It's not just some afterthought or just a list of things that we're like, oh, we don't have that yet, we should do it. It's like, we need to do it at some point. If we want it to be seen in a game, we have to do it, and if we have to be the first, then that's what we're going to do.
Representation in video games gets a lot of gamers rather heated. We spoke at length about this in part 1 of the episode, so I don't want to rehash that conversation. I'd suggest you go take a listen if you'd like to catch up. A common thread of negativity we see when more diverse characters are introduced is typically the phrase, nobody cares, or I don't care. I don't care about the sexuality of this character in the game. I don't care if my character is male or female, white or a person of color. I don't care. Yet, this isn't the statement made with every narrative. It is specifically a statement made around character narratives that incorporate previously underrepresented groups.
I mean, personally, I try not to take it to heart, and it kind of goes into what I'll say after. Like, if we're talking about like very like hardcore toxicity, like obviously like we have stuff for that in game. But if we talk about more a general question, especially what you said, like the people who say I don't care, those are typically the people that are just there for the gameplay. And so the beauty of it is I can tell them like it's great that you don't care because you don't have to pay attention to the narrative. If you're here for the gameplay, do that. But this kind of stuff matters to certain people, and ultimately it has value in narrative because any kind of characteristic like that in a character, in a person's background, informs who they are and informs why they are where they are. Like if we compare like two characters, for example, Osa, who came out pretty recently, her being trans has informed her career path and why she is where she is instead of a more traditional military career. And it's the same for, let's say, Zofia, who's married with kids, and it kind of informs the kind of soldier that she is and why she follows a certain specific career path that she followed. So I think, especially for that population of players, they kind of only bring that up when it's obviously queerness and that kind of like marginalized identity. But they tend to forget that like we do that for all characters across the board.
It's very easy to talk about the need for representation in video games, but it's also very easy to get it incredibly wrong in video games. We've seen that before. I've personally always felt that Siege does it extremely well, allowing for diverse stories and characters while still ensuring a rad gaming experience for the player. The balancing act is handled with grace and allows for a really immersive story that ultimately makes for an incredible piece of art and, most importantly, a fun game to play. So how do they do that?
I think there's kind of like three components to that. The first being that to begin with, we're a team that really cares about this kind of stuff. We're not just doing it to do it. I'd like, from my experience at least, especially working with Thunderbird and with Osa, like the team is very much like enthusiastic about creating characters like this, and so across like all kind of roles, not just narrative, but also like modeling, concept art, everything. Like we really want to do this right, and so I think that borrows itself, that kind of helps with the whole process, because I can say that like I feel confident in my part of the process because I care, but ultimately everyone has to care for it to to be a solid thing all around. The second one is that we talk to the people that we want to represent in across all the characters. For Osa, we talked to trans women, we talked to representatives in Croatia. For Thunderbird, we talked to women from the Nakota people. For Malusi, we contacted locals to talk about the kind of representation they wanted to see. We do that for every character that we can. And then the third thing is in casting. At least, I have a lot of visibility on the main casting, the English casting, since that's the main language of the game. And, we always want to cast someone that's going to be as representative as possible of the character. Like for Osa, from the very beginning, like we knew she was going to be a trans woman. And so there was no question. It was the main casting is going to be a trans woman.
There's a thread here that runs throughout this representation conversation. It's the importance of telling real and authentic stories. If you've listened to this entire season of Tech Girl Talks, you'll know that this is actually the thread of almost every episode: gaming and esports as a vehicle to tell those stories. And I can assure you it wasn't planned. This is just what's happened as we've done these week by week. I've tried throughout season 2 to tell the stories of gaming and esports from the perspective of someone passionate but also working in the industries. I hope I've done justice to those stories and that you've walked away informed, educated, or entertained. Hopefully all three. I've been privileged to be able to tell these stories alongside some of the most incredible names in the global gaming and esports scene. I'm grateful for their time and knowledge. This episode marks the end of Season 2 of Tech Girl Talks. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please do leave a review. Thank you for listening and supporting this little labor of love. I'd also like to thank my personal brand sponsors, Logitech G and Vox Gaming. Tech Girl Talks is not an income earner for me. My income is made as an esports shoutcaster and host. However, my personal sponsors allow me some freedom to pursue projects like this podcast, which I'm very grateful for. Playlist Studios also deserves a thanks for convincing me to give podcasting a go. You have definitely released a dragon, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to get back in my cage. If you'd like to engage more on the topics I've chatted about, or you have some ideas for other episodes you'd love to hear, feel free to reach out to me at TechGirlZA on Twitter and Instagram. Make sure to follow Tech Girl Talks on your favorite podcasting platforms. Who knows? Maybe we'll be back for Season 3.